My name is Ben Carter, and up until a few weeks ago, the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me was winning the county fair pie, eating contest 3 years running. Life in rural Ohio was comfortable, predictable, and honestly, a little boring. I'd always felt a pull towards something more, something wilder. That's why, after a particularly soul-crushing day at my accounting job, spreadsheets and tax forms can really do a number on a guy's spirit, I impulsively applied for a position with the United States Forest Service. I didn't have any grand illusions of becoming some grizzled mountain man, wrestling bears and single-handedly preventing forest fires. My application was for a relatively low-level position, forest technician. The job description was vague, something about assisting with resource management, data collection, and general maintenance of designated forest areas. It sounded like a step up from staring at numbers all day, and the idea of spending my days surrounded by nature was undeniably appealing. To my surprise, I got an interview. It was a video call with a woman named Agent Davies. She had a no-nonsense demeanor, short, practical haircut, and eyes that seemed to see right through my polite but ultimately uninspired answers. I figured I'd blown it, but a week later, an email landed in my inbox with a job offer. The location was, well, that was the interesting part. It wasn't in Ohio or even a neighboring state. I was being assigned to a remote ranger station deep within the Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. Redwoods. It felt like a world away from my life in Ohio. But that was the point, wasn't it? I accepted the offer almost immediately. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was enough, and the thought of living amongst those giant trees, breathing that fresh air, felt like a dream come true. The drive out was long but beautiful. As I got closer to the coast, the landscape transformed. Rolling hills gave way to towering forests, the air grew cooler and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. When I finally reached the small town nearest to my assigned station, I felt a sense of anticipation mixed with a healthy dose of nervousness. The ranger station itself was a modest, slightly weathered wooden building nestled in a small clearing. It looked functional but definitely not fancy. A couple of older pickup trucks were parked out front, and a faded sign read, "Oric Ranger Station, U.S. Forest Service." My supervisor was a man named Ranger Johnson. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and kind eyes that held a hint of something unreadable behind them. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a quiet smile. "Welcome to Oric, Carter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Glad to have you on board." He showed me around the station, which consisted of a small office, a communal kitchen and living area, a supply room, and a few basic dorm-style bedrooms. I was assigned a small room with a single bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the dense forest. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and private, and for now, that was enough. The first few days were mostly filled with paperwork, safety briefings, and introductions to the other members of the team. There was Sarah, a sharp and efficient woman in her late 20s, who seemed to know everything about the local flora and fauna. Then there was old Dale, a quiet, grizzled veteran who had been with the Forest Service for over 30 years and seemed to prefer the company of trees to people. Everyone was polite and welcoming, but there was also a subtle undercurrent of something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like they were all aware of something I wasn't, a shared understanding that went beyond the usual camaraderie of colleagues. On my third day, Ranger Johnson sat me down in the office. "All right, Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair, "time to go over some of the specifics of your role here. As you know, the Redwoods are a unique and precious ecosystem. Our job is to protect them, and that involves more than just trail maintenance and collecting data." He pulled out a thick binder labeled Operational Protocols, Redwood National and State Parks, Internal Use Only. It looked official, but also strangely worn, like it had been handled countless times. "This," Ranger Johnson said, tapping the binder, "contains everything you need to know about your duties. Pay close attention, Carter. Some of these protocols are unusual, but they are absolutely vital to follow." I opened the binder, and the first few pages were standard stuff: emergency procedures, radio communication protocols, wildlife safety guidelines. Then I started to notice things that were a little off. Rule number 1: under no circumstances are you to deviate from designated trails after nightfall. This seemed reasonable enough. Getting lost in the dark in a dense forest like this would be incredibly dangerous. Rule number 2: do not attempt to approach or interact with any wildlife exhibiting unnatural behavior. Report such instances immediately to your supervising ranger. Okay, that made sense too. Rabid animals were a real threat. But then the rules started to get stranger. Rule number 30: avoid whistling or making loud, repetitive noises in areas designated as old-growth zones. Old growth zones were apparently sections of the forest with particularly ancient and large trees. Why no whistling? Rule number 40. If you encounter any structures or markings that appear to be intentionally placed and are not consistent with park infrastructure, e.g., cairns, symbols carved into trees, unusual arrangements of objects, do not touch them. Note their location and report them immediately. This one gave me pause. What kind of structures or markings were they talking about? Rule number 50. During the hours of darkness, if you hear any sounds that cannot be readily identified as originating from known local wildlife, seek immediate shelter and do not attempt to investigate. This was starting to feel less like standard operating procedure and more like a set of rules designed to keep us safe from something unknown. As I flipped through the pages, the rules became increasingly specific and unsettling. Rule number 6. Never acknowledge or respond to any voices or sounds that seem to emanate from beyond the tree line in areas bordering the Blackwood section, as map coordinates will be provided separately. The Blackwood section? That didn't sound very official. Rule number 7. Do not consume any berries, mushrooms, or other wild edibles unless they have been positively identified by a senior ranger. Even then, exercise caution. This was standard wilderness advice, but the emphasis felt heavier. Rule number 80. If you find any personal belongings that do not belong to a member of your team, e.g., clothing, equipment, notes, do not handle them. Mark the location clearly and report it. This felt particularly ominous. What kind of personal belongings would we find in the middle of the forest that didn't belong to anyone we knew? Rule number 9. Under no circumstances are you to enter the Three Sisters Grove without explicit authorization from the park superintendent. The Three Sisters Grove was marked on a map Ranger Johnson showed me as a particularly dense and remote area. What was so special about it? Rule number 10 was the one that really made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was written in bold, underlined text. If you ever feel an overwhelming sense of dread or unease in a particular area, trust your instincts and leave immediately. Do not attempt to rationalize or investigate the feeling. Just leave. I looked up at Ranger Johnson, my brow furrowed. These rules, they're a bit unusual, aren't they? He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. This isn't like any other forest, Carter. There are things out here, things that most people can't even imagine. Our job is not just to protect the trees, but also to protect the outside world from what lies within them. His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what kind of things were out here, but something in his expression told me that maybe I didn't want to know. Just follow the rules, Carter, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. He handed me a detailed map of the park, with various zones and points of interest marked. He also gave me a radio and instructed me on its proper use. You'll be patrolling Sector 4 tomorrow, he said. It's a relatively quiet area, mostly old growth. Just familiarize yourself with the trails and keep an eye out for anything unusual. I spent the rest of the day studying the map and rereading the rules. The more I read them, the more uneasy I felt. It was like the Forest Service wasn't just concerned about natural dangers, they were actively trying to prevent us from stumbling upon something else. That night, I lay in my small bed, the sounds of the forest filtering through my open window. The chirping of crickets and the hooting of owls were familiar and comforting, but beneath them, I could sense a deeper, more primal soundscape, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant howl of something that didn't quite sound like a coyote. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing, filled with questions and a growing sense of apprehension. What secrets did these ancient woods hold? What were the things Ranger Johnson had alluded to? And what would happen if I broke one of those strange rules? As I finally drifted off to sleep, I had a vivid and unsettling dream. I was walking through a dense part of the forest, the trees towering above me like silent giants. The air was heavy and still, and an unnatural silence hung in the air. Then, I saw it, a flash of movement at the edge of my vision. Something tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed in the dim light, watching me from the shadows. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. The last thing I saw before waking up in a cold sweat was the creature slowly stepping out of the darkness, its long, skeletal fingers reaching for me. It was just a dream, I told myself, trying to shake off the lingering fear. But as the first rays of dawn crept through my window, casting long shadows across the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that my new job was going to be anything but ordinary. The strange rules, Ranger Johnson's cryptic warning, and that terrifying dream, they all pointed to a hidden reality within these ancient woods, a reality that I was now a part of whether I wanted to be or not. And as I prepared for my first solo patrol, I couldn't help but wonder what secret Sector 4 held, and whether I would encounter anything that would make those strange rules suddenly make terrifying sense. The morning air was crisp and cool as I set out for Sector 4. The towering redwood trees lived up to every expectation I had. They were colossal, their massive trunks stretching hundreds of feet into the sky, their canopies so dense that only dappled sunlight managed to filter through to the forest floor. It felt like stepping into another world, a primeval realm where time moved at a different pace. I followed the designated trail, my boots crunching on the fallen needles and leaves. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustling in the undergrowth or the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. It was peaceful, even majestic, but the strange rules Ranger Johnson had given me kept nagging at the back of my mind. Every unusual sound, every oddly shaped shadow, made me wonder if it was connected to the unspoken dangers he had hinted at. My task for the day was primarily observation and reporting. I had a checklist of things to look for: signs of erosion, fallen trees blocking trails, evidence of human activity outside designated areas, and anything that seemed out of the ordinary. I carried a GPS device to mark locations and a notebook to record my observations. For the first few hours, everything was uneventful. I saw a few deer grazing peacefully, a couple of squirrels scampering up tree trunks, and a variety of interesting fungi growing on decaying logs. It was exactly the kind of serene wilderness experience I had hoped for when I took this job. Then, around mid-morning, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a small cairn of stones, carefully balanced on a moss-covered log just off the side of the trail. It wasn't very large, maybe a foot high, but it looked deliberately placed. Rule number 4 flashed through my mind: if you encounter any structures or markings that appear to be intentionally placed and are not consistent with park infrastructure, do not touch them. Note their location and report them immediately. I hesitated for a moment. It was just a pile of rocks, wasn't it? Maybe some hiker had built it for fun. But something about its placement, the way the stones were so carefully stacked, felt intentional, almost ritualistic. I took out my notebook and GPS device, recorded the coordinates and a brief description, and then continued on my way, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. A little further down the trail, I noticed something else. Carved into the smooth bark of a large redwood tree was a symbol. It wasn't a typical carving of initials or a heart. It was more intricate, almost geometric, with lines and circles that didn't seem to represent anything familiar. Again, rule number 4 echoed in my head. I documented this as well, taking a photograph with my phone in addition to noting its location. By lunchtime, the initial tranquility of the forest had been replaced by a growing sense of unease. The cairn and the symbol, while not overtly threatening, felt like violations of the natural order, subtle hints of something unseen at work in these woods. I found a small clearing near a stream and sat down to eat my packed lunch. As I munched on my sandwich, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the surrounding trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was probably just my nerves, I told myself. The rules were getting to me. After lunch, I continued my patrol, venturing deeper into Sector 4. The trees here seemed even older and larger, their branches draped with moss-like ancient beards. The air grew heavier, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. It was in this part of the sector that I heard it. It started as a faint sound, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. At first, I dismissed it as the wind rustling through the leaves. But then it grew slightly louder, more distinct. It sounded like whistling. Rule number 30: avoid whistling or making loud, repetitive noises in areas designated as old-growth zones. I checked my map. I was definitely in an old-growth zone, but I wasn't whistling. Neither was anyone else, as far as I could tell. I was completely alone. The whistling continued, a soft, melodic tune that seemed to drift from somewhere deeper in the woods. It wasn't a natural sound. It sounded like someone was deliberately whistling a specific melody. It was a simple tune, almost childlike, but there was something unsettling about it in this vast, silent forest. I stopped walking and listened intently. The whistling seemed to be coming from my right, somewhere beyond a thicket of ferns. My first instinct was to investigate, to see who was out here whistling in violation of the rules. But then rule number 10 flashed in my mind. If you ever feel an overwhelming sense of dread or unease in a particular area, trust your instincts and leave immediately. Do not attempt to rationalize or investigate the feeling, just leave. A cold shiver ran down my spine. There was something about that whistling, the way it seemed to echo through the silent woods, that filled me with a profound sense of unease. It wasn't a rational fear, but it was powerful nonetheless. I hesitated for a moment, my curiosity battling with my growing apprehension. The rational part of my brain told me it was probably just another hiker, someone who didn't know the rules. But the primal part of me, the part that had been on edge ever since Ranger Johnson's warnings, screamed at me to turn around and leave. Taking a deep breath, I decided to trust my instincts. I turned and started walking back the way I had come, my pace quickening. The whistling continued for a while, seemingly following me, the simple melody now sounding almost mocking. Then, as I put more distance between myself and the source, it gradually faded away, leaving behind an unnerving silence. I didn't stop until I reached a more open area of the forest, where the sunlight filtered through more easily. I leaned against a large redwood, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. What had that been? Who had been whistling? And why did it make me feel so profoundly uncomfortable? As the afternoon wore on, I tried to put the whistling incident out of my mind and focus on my patrol, but the feeling of being watched persisted, and every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, my senses on high alert. Later in the afternoon, as I was making my way back towards the ranger station, I stumbled upon something else that made my blood run cold. It was lying just off the side of the trail, partially hidden beneath a pile of fallen leaves. At first, I thought it was a piece of discarded trash, but as I got closer, I realized it was an article of clothing, a child's red jacket. Rule number 80: if you find any personal belongings that do not belong to a member of your team, do not handle them. Mark the location clearly and report it. The jacket looked relatively new, but it was dirty and slightly torn. It was far too small to belong to any of the rangers I worked with. Who would bring a child this deep into the forest? And why would they leave their jacket behind? A wave of dread washed over me. I thought of the whistling, the cairn, the strange symbol, and now this child's jacket. It felt like pieces of a disturbing puzzle were starting to fall into place, painting a picture that I didn't want to see. I carefully marked the location of the jacket with a bright orange ribbon from my pack and recorded its coordinates. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else nearby, partially buried in the dirt. It was small and white, and it looked like a bone. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to get any closer, didn't want to confirm what I suspected, but curiosity and a growing sense of horror compelled me forward. I knelt down and carefully brushed away the surrounding dirt and leaves. It was indeed a bone, small and delicate, like a finger bone. My mind raced. The child's jacket, the bone, could they be connected? Had something terrible happened here? I stood up, my legs feeling shaky. The tranquility of the redwood forest had completely vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of menace. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of Sector 4, to get back to the relative safety of the ranger station. I started to run, my boots pounding on the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, didn't dare to stop until I could see the familiar outline of the ranger station through the trees. I burst through the door, my face flushed and my chest heaving. Ranger Johnson was in the office, talking on the radio. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly at my disheveled appearance. "Carter, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I struggled to catch my breath. I found something in Sector 4. I stammered. "A child's jacket, and a bone." Ranger Johnson's expression turned grim. He put down the radio and stood up, his eyes fixed on me. "Show me on the map," he said, his voice low and serious. I pointed to the location on my map, my hand trembling slightly. Ranger Johnson studied the coordinates for a long moment, his brow furrowed. "Did you touch anything?" he asked, his gaze intense. "No, sir," I replied quickly. "I followed the rules. I marked the location." He nodded slowly. "Good. You did the right thing, Carter." He picked up the radio again. "Davies, come in. We have a situation in Sector 4. I need you and Dale here immediately." As I waited for the others to arrive, a cold dread settled over me. The strange rules, the warnings, the unsettling encounters in the forest. It all felt connected now, pointing towards something dark and sinister hidden within these ancient trees. And I had a terrible feeling that I had only just scratched the surface of the horrors that lurked in the Redwood National and State Parks. The pie eating contest back in Ohio suddenly seemed like a very distant and innocent memory. Agent Davies and Dale arrived quickly, their faces etched with concern. Davies, usually so composed, had a tight, worried expression. Dale, ever the stoic, looked even more grim than usual, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows of the ranger station itself. Ranger Johnson quickly filled them in on my findings, pointing to the marked location on the map. Davies listened intently, occasionally interjecting with sharp, pointed questions. Dale remained silent, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "You did exactly right, Carter," Davies said, her voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of anxiety. Do not, under any circumstances, feel like you should have done more. Handling such items is strictly prohibited for a reason. What reason? I asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. The three senior rangers exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. It was Ranger Johnson who finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. There are things in these woods, Carter, things that can latch onto objects. Things that can use them as anchors, as ways to influence our world. His words sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like something out of a ghost story, not a professional briefing from the US Forest Service. I looked at Davies and Dale, searching for any sign that they thought Ranger Johnson was being overly dramatic, but their expressions were serious, confirming the gravity of his statement. The rules we gave you, Davies continued, they aren't just arbitrary. They are designed to protect us, to keep certain entities at bay. Entities. I repeated, the word feeling foreign and unsettling on my tongue. Dale finally spoke, his voice raspy and low, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. This forest, it's old. Older than any of us can truly comprehend. And in places like this, things can take root that don't belong in the natural world. Things that feed on fear, on sorrow, on loss. His words painted a dark and disturbing picture. I thought back to the overwhelming sense of dread I had felt in Sector 4, the feeling of being watched, the eerie whistling. It all started to make a terrifying kind of sense. We need to secure the area, Davy said, her tone decisive. Johnson, you and Carter will come with me. Dale, you stay here and monitor the radio. If anything unusual happens, you contact us immediately. Dale nodded silently, his hand resting on the radio on the desk. Ranger Johnson gathered some equipment, a couple of evidence bags, gloves, and what looked like some kind of specialized sensor device. As we headed out in one of the pickup trucks, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The usual camaraderie of the team was gone, replaced by a shared sense of apprehension. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the forest, making the familiar landscape seem alien and threatening. When we reached the location I had marked on the map, Davies immediately established a perimeter. She instructed us to put on gloves and to be extremely careful where we stepped. The air here felt different, heavier, colder. Even the sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. We carefully approached the spot where I had found the jacket. It was still there, a splash of faded red against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. Davies meticulously photographed it from several angles before carefully placing it into an evidence bag. Next, we focused on the area where I had found the bone. Davies used a small trowel to gently excavate the surrounding soil. Soon, more fragments of bone began to emerge. They were small and delicate, definitely belonging to a child. As Davies carefully collected the bone fragments, Ranger Johnson moved around the area with the sensor device. It looked like a handheld scanner with a small screen. He moved slowly and deliberately, occasionally stopping to examine the readings. Anything? Davies asked, her voice hushed. Ranger Johnson shook his head. Not yet, but there's a definite energy signature here. Something residual. Residual energy. It sounded like something you'd hear on a paranormal investigation show. I was starting to feel like I had stumbled into a reality far stranger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As the last rays of sunlight faded, casting long, eerie shadows, Ranger Johnson's sensor suddenly emitted a series of rapid beeps. He stopped and stared at the screen, his eyes wide. What is it? Davies asked urgently. There's a concentration of something, about 50 yards that way, Ranger Johnson said, pointing into the deepening gloom. The readings are off the charts. Davies looked in the direction he was pointing, her expression unreadable. Let's check it out, she said, her hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on her belt. We cautiously made our way through the undergrowth, Ranger Johnson leading the way with the sensor. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. We reached a small clearing. In the center of it stood a massive redwood tree, its trunk wider than any I had seen before. Its bark was gnarled and twisted, and its branches reached towards the sky like skeletal arms. There was something undeniably ancient and malevolent about this tree. Ranger Johnson's sensor was going crazy, emitting a continuous high-pitched whine. Davies shone her flashlight on the base of the tree. Carved into the bark, much larger and more intricate than the symbol I had seen earlier, was a series of strange symbols. They looked ancient, almost alien. As we stared at the carvings, a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. It was deeper, more resonant, and it seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. We all froze, our eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct snap of a twig. Something was moving in the shadows. Back to the truck. Davies whispered urgently, her hand now resting on the holstered sidearm I hadn't even realized she was carrying. We retreated quickly but cautiously, keeping our eyes on the tree line. As we reached the edge of the clearing, we saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its head was obscured by shadow, but I could see two glowing red eyes staring back at us. It was the creature from my dream, the one with the skeletal fingers. A primal fear gripped me, paralyzing me for a moment. It couldn't be real, I thought. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the terror in Davies and Ranger Johnson's eyes told me otherwise. They had seen this before. The creature took a step forward, and a low, rasping growl emanated from its throat. It was a sound that promised pain and suffering. "Run!" Davies yelled, shoving me forward. We turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, the terrifying growl of the creature echoing behind us. I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to reach out and touch me. We burst out of the trees and scrambled into the pickup truck. Ranger Johnson fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the truck into reverse, backing out of the area as fast as he could. I looked back through the rear window. The creature was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us go, its glowing red eyes burning into my soul. We didn't stop until we were back at the ranger station. Dale was waiting for us, his face pale with worry. We quickly recounted what we had seen, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and adrenaline. "It's been a while since we've had an encounter like that," Ranger Johnson said, his voice trembling slightly. I was hoping maybe it had gone. "Gone where?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Davies shook her head grimly. "It never really goes, Carter. It just sleeps. Until something wakes it up. The child's jacket, the bone, the strange symbols. Had my discovery awakened something ancient and evil in these woods? We need to report this," Davies said, picking up the radio. "Superintendent, come in. We have a code red in Sector 4. As Davies spoke into the radio, relaying the terrifying events of the evening, I looked out into the darkness surrounding the ranger station. The familiar sounds of the forest now seemed sinister, filled with unseen threats. I knew one thing for sure: my life in the Redwood National and State Parks was never going to be the peaceful escape I had imagined. I had stumbled into a world of ancient secrets and unimaginable horrors, and I had a terrible feeling that my first encounter with the darkness was just the beginning. The strange rules suddenly seemed less like guidelines and more like desperate attempts to hold back something truly terrifying. And I couldn't help but wonder if even those rules would be enough to keep us safe. The arrival of the park superintendent, a stern, faced woman named Ms. Albright, brought a flurry of activity to the ranger station. She arrived with 2 armed park police officers and a team of specialists who looked like they were equipped for anything from a scientific expedition to a military operation. Ms. Albright listened intently as Davies recounted our encounter, her expression growing increasingly grave. She asked detailed questions about the creature's appearance, its behavior, and the exact location of the child's jacket and bones. "The Blackwood has been restless lately," she said, her voice low and troubled. "We've had increased reports of unusual activity in the surrounding areas. I was hoping it wouldn't escalate this quickly." "The Blackwood?" I asked, the name sending a shiver down my spine. "It's what we call that section of the forest," Dale explained, pointing to an area on the map marked with a thick black line. "It's different. The trees are older, the shadows are deeper, and things live there that don't abide by the laws of nature." Ms. Albright elaborated. "There are legends, Carter, stories passed down for generations by the local tribes. They speak of ancient beings that dwell within the heart of the forest, creatures tied to the land, beings that are not meant to be disturbed. We believe what you saw is one of them." My mind reeled. Legends, ancient beings. This was far beyond anything I had ever imagined encountering as a forest technician. "The rules," I said. "They're all about avoiding these beings." Ms. Albright nodded. "Exactly. The rules are designed to minimize our interactions with them, to keep us from venturing into their territory or inadvertently disturbing them. Rule number 6, the one about not acknowledging sounds from beyond the tree line in the Blackwood section, that's specifically about this creature." "But it came out of the Blackwood section," I pointed out. "Why?" "The child's remains. The symbols, something drew it out," Davies said grimly. "Something disturbed its slumber. The specialists began preparing to return to Sector 4. Ms. Albright instructed me to proceed with extreme caution and to focus on recovering the remaining bones and any other evidence. She also stressed the importance of not engaging with the creature if possible. Our priority is containment, not confrontation, she emphasized. We need to ensure the safety of our personnel and the public. I wanted to go with them, to see what else they would find, but Miss Albright insisted that I stay at the station. "You've done your part, Carter," she said. "You followed protocol, and that's what matters. Now let the professionals handle this." The waiting was agonizing. Every rustle of leaves outside, every creak of the old building made me jump. I kept replaying the image of the creature's glowing red eyes in my mind, the memory sending waves of fear through me. Hours passed. The team in Sector 4 radioed in periodically, reporting their progress. They had recovered more bone fragments and had documented the strange symbols on the tree. Ranger Johnson's sensor readings remained high in the clearing. But there was no further sighting of the creature. As dawn approached, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the team returned to the station. They looked exhausted and shaken. "We found something else," Davies said, her voice barely above a whisper. She laid a small, intricately carved wooden doll on the table. It was crude but clearly made with care, and it had the same strange symbols carved into its surface as the tree. "We found it buried near the base of the Redwood," Ranger Johnson added. "It was like an offering." Miss Albright examined the doll carefully, her expression troubled. "This confirms our suspicions," she said. "This is not just a random occurrence. Something has been disturbed, and this creature is reacting to it. What are we going to do?" I asked, the fear in my voice palpable. "We're going to increase patrols in the area, especially around the Blackwood," Miss Albright said. "We're going to reinforce the warning signs and make sure the public stays away from Sector 4, and we're going to monitor the situation closely. If the creature reappears, we'll have to take further action." She looked at me, her gaze serious. "Carter, I know this has been a traumatic experience for you. You handled it well, but I understand if you want to reconsider your position here." The thought had crossed my mind many times throughout the night. But as I looked at the faces of the other rangers, at their quiet determination to protect this forest, a sense of resolve began to form within me. This place was dangerous, yes, but it was also important, and I had a role to play in protecting it, even if it meant facing my fears. "I'll stay," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Ms. Albright nodded slowly. "I expected nothing less. But you need to be extra vigilant, Carter. Follow the rules, no matter what. And if you ever feel that overwhelming sense of dread again, don't hesitate to leave." Life at the Auric Ranger Station didn't return to normal after that night. There was a palpable tension in the air, a constant awareness of the unseen presence lurking in the depths of the forest. We all became more cautious, more observant. Every strange sound, every unusual shadow was now viewed with suspicion. I continued my patrols, but I never ventured into Sector 4 again. That area was now off limits, designated for specialized teams only. I was reassigned to a different sector, one that was considered less active. But even in the quieter parts of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees in a certain way, I could almost hear that eerie whistling again. And every now and then, in the periphery of my vision, I would catch a glimpse of something tall and gaunt moving among the shadows. I learned more about the legends of the Blackwood, about the ancient beings that were said to inhabit its depths. Some believed they were guardians of the forest, protectors of its ancient secrets. Others believed they were malevolent entities, creatures of darkness that fed on human fear. The truth, I suspected, was probably somewhere in between, something far more complex and unknowable than any of the stories could fully capture. The child's remains were eventually identified through DNA testing. They belonged to a young boy who had gone missing several years prior. How his remains ended up so deep in the forest, and what role the creature played in his disappearance, remained a mystery. The incident was never made public, the official explanation citing a tragic hiking accident. The Forest Service, it seemed, preferred to keep the more unsettling truths hidden. I worked at the Auric Ranger Station for another year. In that time, there were other incidents, other strange occurrences that hinted at the dark secrets hidden within the Redwood National and State Parks. There were unexplained sounds in the night, fleeting glimpses of unnatural figures, and an ever-present sense of unease that permeated the very air we breathed. I followed the rules. I never deviated from the designated trails after nightfall. I never whistled in the old-growth zones. I never approached anything that seemed unnatural. And whenever that overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, I trusted my instincts and left. Eventually, I decided to move on. The constant tension, The knowledge of the unseen horrors lurking just beyond the tree line had taken its toll. I returned to Ohio, to the familiar comfort and predictability of my old life. But a part of me remained in those ancient redwood forests, forever marked by what I had seen and experienced. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I can still hear that low, guttural growl echoing in my memory, and I know, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood is still there, its ancient secrets undisturbed, its silent watchers still roaming among the giant trees. And somewhere, deep within its shadowy embrace, the creature with the glowing red eyes continues its endless slumber, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble into its domain. And the strange rules are all that stand between us and the darkness that lies beneath the ancient canopy.